Good afternoon, my friends. It is now time for us to bring our story from The Wind in the Willows to a close. We are on the final chapter called The Return of Toad. Now, this is the last time for this book that you will hear me say, and are you ready? All right. Wait, I didn't hear from over here on this side. I said, are you ready? What about this side? Are you ready? All right, here we go. You. We'll have to answer each and every question with... All right, good job, with complete sentences. All right, let's get going with the return of Toad. When it began to grow dark, the rat called them all back into the parlor. He stood each of them beside one of the little heaps of weapons. Then he dressed them for the coming battle. When all was ready, the badger took a lantern in one paw, grasped his great stick with the other, and said, "Now then, follow me. Mole first, rat next, Toad last. Toady, don't chatter." The badger led them along the river, and then suddenly swung himself over the edge into a hole, a little above the water. The mole and the rat followed. Toad, of course, managed to slip and fall into the water with a loud splash. The tunnel was cold, dark, damp, and low. Poor Toad began to shiver. The lantern was far ahead, and he could not help lagging behind in the darkness. The terror of being left behind seized him, and he ran forward with such a rush that it upset the rat into the mole, and the mole into the badger. The badger thought they were being attacked. He drew a pistol and almost shot Toad. Then suddenly they heard sound, far up over their heads, a confused murmur of sound. The passage now began to slope upward. A sound of laughter and applause broke out, this time very close to them. "What a time those weasels are having," said the badger. They hurried along till they found themselves under the trap door that led up to the pantry. The badger said, "Now, all together." Hoisting each other up, they found themselves standing in the pantry, with only a door between them and the unsuspecting enemies. "Our thanks to clever Toad," a weasel laughed. "Just let me at him," muttered Toad. The badger drew himself up and shouted, "The hour has come," and flung the door open wide. What a squealing, a squeaking, and screeching filled the air. Weasels dived under tables and sprang for the windows. Ferrets ran for the fireplace and jammed the chimney. Tables and chairs were upset, and glass and china crashed to the floor as the heroes strode into the room. They were only 4 in all, but to the panic-stricken weasels, the hall seemed to have a monstrous animals, whooping and waving enormous weapons. The battle was soon over, as terrified weasels shrieked across the lawn. On the floor they lay a dozen or so of the enemy, who did not escape. The mole was busily fitting handcuffs on them. "Mole," Badger said, "you're the best of fellows. Slip outside and check on the stoat lookouts. I've an idea that, thanks to you, we won't have much trouble from them tonight." Toad felt rather hurt that the badger didn't say pleasant things to him, as he had to the mole, and tell him what a fine fellow he was, and how splendidly he had fought. For Toad was quite pleased with the way he himself had gone after the chief weasel. He sent him flying across the table. Mole returned through the window, chuckling. "From what I can tell," he reported, "even the stoats threw down their rifles and fled. They've all disappeared by now." "Excellent animal," said the badger. "Now, there's just one more thing. I want you to take those fellows on the floor there upstairs with you and have some bedrooms cleaned out. See that they swept under the beds and put clean sheets and pillowcases on, and then put them out by the back door. I'm very pleased with you, Mole." The following morning, Toad had overslept as usual. He came down to breakfast and found nothing to eat. This did not improve his temper. After all, it was his own house. Through the windows of the breakfast room, he could see the mole and rat sitting out on the lawn. The badger, who was in the armchair, remarked rather shortly, "I'm sorry, Toad, but I'm afraid there's a heavy morning's work in front of you. We really ought to have a banquet at once to celebrate this affair. It's expected of you. In fact, it's the rule. If we have the banquet tonight, the invitations will have to be written and sent at once. Now, sit down at the table and write to all of our friends. I'll lend you a hand too. I'll order the banquet." "What?" cried Toad. "Me? Stay indoors and write a lot of rotten letters? I'll be... What? Of course, dear Badger. You wish it done, it shall be done." The Badger looked at him with suspicion, then left the room. As soon as the door closed, Toad hurried to the writing table. A fine idea had occurred to him while he was talking. He could write the invitations, and he would take care of mention the leading part he had taken in the fight, and he would include a program of entertainment for the evening. Something like this, as he sketched it out in his head. Speech by Toad. There will be other speeches by Toad later. Address by Toad. Our prison system. The waterways of England. Horse stealing. On being an English squire. Song by Toad, composed by himself. Other compositions by Toad, sung in the evening by the composer. Toad worked very hard on his letters. He got a weasel to help deliver them, and he had sent out all the invitations by noon. When the other animals came back, Badger and Rat caught Toad by the arm. "Now look here, Toad," said the Rat. "It's about this banquet. We know you too well. We want you to understand clearly, once and for all, that there has to be no speeches and no songs." "Can't I sing them in just one little song?" Toad pleaded with sorrow in his eyes. "No, not one little song," replied the Rat. "You know well that your songs are all conceit, and your speeches are full of self-praise. It's for your own good, Toady." Toad at last raised his head, but it was but a small thing, merely to hear the great applause that brings out my best qualities. And pressing the handkerchief to his face, he left the room. "It's lucky we came upon that little weasel, just as he was setting out with Toad's invitations," said the Rat. "They were simply disgraceful. Fortunately, Mole has agreed to write out new invitation cards." "Good Mole," said Badger proudly. At last the hour for the banquet began to draw near. Toad had gone up to the bedroom to pout. After a while, however, he began giggling shyly to himself. He got up, locked the door, and drew the curtains across the windows. Then he set up all the chairs in the room in front of him, like an audience, and began to sing loudly and with great gusto. Toad's last little song. "The Toad came home. There was panic in the parlor and howling in the hall. There was crying in the cowshed and shrieking in the stall. When the Toad came home, when the Toad came home, there was smashing in of windows and crashing in of door. There was pestering of weasels that fainted on the floor. When the Toad came home. Bang go the drums, the trumpeters are tooting, and the soldiers are saluting, and the cannon they are shooting, and the motor cars are tooting, as the hero comes. Shout, hooray, and let each one of a crowd try, and shout it very loud, in honor of an animal of whom you're just proud. For it's Toad's great day." He sang it all over again. Then he heaved a deep sigh, a long, long, long sigh. And then he parted his hair in the middle, slicked it down, unlocked the door, and went quietly down the stairs to greet his guests. All the animals cheered when Toad entered. They crowded round to congratulate him and say nice things about his courage, his cleverness, and his fighting qualities. But Toad only smiled and murmured, "Oh, it was nothing. Oh, please. Really, not nothing at all." Otter came forward with a shout and threw his arm around Toad's neck. Toad only remarked gently, "Badger was the mastermind. The mole and the water rat bore the brunt of the fighting. I merely served in the ranks and did little of nothing." The animals were puzzled by this unexpected attitude of his. Toad rather liked his new kind of attention. He moved from one guest to the other, making his modest responses, and thus everyone now found him to be very interesting. The badger had ordered only the best, and the banquet was a great success. There was much talking, laughter, and joking among the animals, but through it all, Toad only murmured polite comments to the animals on either side of him. He never once remarked on himself. Badger and Rat were in shock at Toad's mannerly behavior, and this gave Toad the greatest satisfaction of all. There were some knockings on the table and cries of, "Toad! Speech! Speech from the Toad! Song! Mr. Toad song!" But Toad only shook his head gently, raised one paw, and smiled, asking his guests to eat and enjoy themselves. It was a banquet for them, not him. He was indeed an altered Toad. After this, the four animals led their lives in great joy, respect, and contentment. Toad selected a handsome gold chain and locket set with pearls that he mailed to the jailer's daughter with a letter of thanks. Even the badger admitted this was a kind, thoughtful thing for Toad to do. Toad also wrote to properly thank the engine driver. He sent him some money for all his pains and troubles. Under severe pressure from Mr. Badger, Toad even found out where the barge woman was and sent her money for the horse he had stolen from her. A lawyer got all the charges against Toad dropped, in exchange for time already served in prison, and because Toad had truly become a more mannerly Toad. Everyone had now been rewarded for his or her part. Sometimes during long summer evenings, the friends would take a stroll together in the wildwood. Now tamed, it was pleasing to see how nicely they were greeted by the animals who lived there. The mother weasels would bring their young ones to the doors of their dens and say, pointing, "Look, baby, there goes the great Mr. Toad, and that's a gallant water rat, a terrible fighter, walking alongside of him. And yonder comes the famous Mr. Mole. You've often heard your father tell of him." But when the children were irritable and quite beyond control, they would quiet them by telling them, if they didn't hush, the terrible gray badger would come and get them. This was not true at all about the badger, for, though he did not care much about society, he was rather fond of children. But the mother weasel's words never failed to have their full effect. The end. All right, my friends, that does it for The Wind in the Willows. You do have some questions to answer, possibly a test. You'll have to see when you click on the next spot. Tomorrow, we will do a closing to the book, so look forward to that. Until next time, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you tomorrow.